Is there something wrong with capitalism? And if so, what exactly would that be? While many people might be under the impression that capitalism is problematic in one way or the other, pointing out what exactly it is that is problematic poses a different, more demanding theoretical challenge. The importance of this challenge becomes clear once we acknowledge the crucial relationship between critique and change. Without the capability of conclusively criticizing capitalism, we are not able to actively influence the possibilities of changing it. Therefore, in this video, I want to give an overview of the theoretical possibilities for criticizing capitalism and provide a critical foundation from which capitalism can be criticized. While I won't be precisely mapping out a particular capitalism critique, instead I'll take a look at the analytical possibilities that we have for a critique of capitalism. The idea of this video is based on an essay by social philosopher Rahel Jaeggi, which I can recommend to anybody who is remotely interested in this subject. But now let's take a look at 3 theoretical approaches for criticizing capitalism. Before we can get to the point where we can actually talk about ways to criticize capitalism, we need to clarify a few things. First off, we need to define what capitalism exactly is. Criticizing capitalism, after all, means to criticize something that is a particular problem of the constitution of the capitalist society and not, for example, a feudal society. Jaeggi defines capitalism as follows, quote, "The term capitalism shall designate a social and economic system, thus encompassing the whole of economic, social, cultural, and political dimensions that mark the way of life in capitalistically constituted societies. Capitalism is thence, in the context of interest here, the designation of an economic and societal order that developed historically in Europe as it broke with the feudal order at the end of the Middle Ages, and which, with a high technological level connected with a substantial concentration of capital, became dominant worldwide as industrial capitalism in the 18th and 19th centuries. In a systematic respect, the following aspects can be shown to be characteristic of the capitalist mode of production and of societies shaped by capitalism. Private ownership of the means of production and a distinction between producers and means of production. The existence of a free labor market as well as the accumulation of capital and, as a consequence, an orientation toward the exploitation of capital, thus toward profit instead of need, toward the cultivation of capital instead of the consumption of it or subsistence on it. In a capitalist society, the market typically functions as a coordinating mechanism for the allocation as well as the distribution of goods, such that capitalism and the market economy are closely bound to one another, though not identical to each other. So let me just quickly summarize this. This definition states that capitalism has a historical component to it, which means that it was formed as a result of historical events and relations. Moreover, capitalism operates through certain economical forces, such as the accumulation of capital and an orientation towards profit. On top of that, the capitalist society is also defined by certain cultural patterns, norms, and political dimensions that express a certain particular capitalist way of living. I know that we could get much deeper into defining capitalism on different levels, but this video is not focused on that, and I just wanted to provide a base understanding that we can have in the back of our heads to understand the way we can criticize capitalism. We will see, though, that the critique of capitalism will also reveal certain dynamics of how it functions. Alright, so before we get into the first critical approach, I want to just clarify another term that I'm going to be using throughout the whole video, which is the term normative. Saying that something is normative means that it implicitly holds certain values of what is right or wrong. If I, for example, say, my friend works at McDonald's, I don't make a normative statement. If I, however, say my friend should not work at McDonald's, I do make a normative statement because there is an underlying conception of what I find to be right and good or wrong and bad. Therefore, it is obviously an important term in regards to any form of critique. We can even say that the success of a certain critical approach will be determined by how normatively convincing and profound its arguments are. Alright, now let's start with our first approach to criticize capitalism. The functional critical approach, as the name suggests, refers to something failing at corresponding with its own functional purpose. A chair that breaks when being used is a dysfunctional chair. Thus, a functional critique of capitalism implies that there is something not working properly about capitalism as a social system. As such, the way that this system is set up is prone to its own crisis. The dysfunctionality within this critical approach can be applied to different things. One example of a functional critique is that capitalism in the long run cannot provide enough resources that are needed for the subsistence of humans within the capitalist system. It's easy to misunderstand this form of critique here, though. The critique is not aimed at the fact that capitalism creates inequalities and asserts this to be wrong because it exploits the people. This type of critique will be discussed in the next part. The functional critique instead faults the very fact that the system fails because it cannot exist in the long run if it undermines its own existence by not providing what is needed for its own reproduction. An example for a functional critique is to say that capitalism is dependent on the very natural resources which it at the same time exploits. Capitalism uses and destroys parts of our nature when the dynamic of its own existence requires the depletion of limited resources such as rainforests and the pollution of air and oceans. At the same time, however, it needs these natural resources for its own continuation. Here we have a functional error that led to the environmental crisis the planet is facing right now. The advantage of a functional critique is that it takes its own critical measure from within the criticized object. This means that the dysfunction is always related to a proper functioning that is already set into the conditions of the criticized object. It doesn't require an external normative standard to which it is measured up against. The dysfunctionality of capitalism then is a dysfunctionality because the functioning of the system itself is being threatened by the way it operates. There is, for example, no other external alternative social way of living as an external critical measure that it needs to hold up against to be morally compared to. Therefore, the functional critical approach is an internal critique. Saying that the critique is internal means that the object of critique is being compared to itself and the norms and standards that it implicitly holds. Now, the functional critique has been criticized such as any other form of capitalism critique. A question, for example, that comes up in regards to functional critique is how someone defines what proper functioning and failing exactly is. To determine when capitalism is properly functioning is much more complicated than in regards to the chair of our example earlier on. Couldn't one argue, for example, that capitalism holds up quite well in regards to dealing with its own crises by adapting with finding different solutions for the problems that come up? From this point of view, the crises are seen as adaptations with which the system improves itself automatically. Here we see how easy it is to turn something supposedly dysfunctional into something that can be seen as part of the functioning. So we need a normative standard by which we can measure what exactly determines the system as functioning or not. Since it's a functional critique, however, this standard needs to come from within the object, or we aren't in the realm of a functional critique anymore, because the core of the functional argument is the fact that the criticized object fails the very functioning it implicitly holds. In philosophy, this is called a telos, which can be translated as an inner goal or target that certain things are driven by. But as we have just seen, it is rather difficult to reasonably define a certain normative standard as the ultimate functional goal of an object. There is, however, another more refined functional critique that can solve this theoretical problem. If we could find specific normative values to be ingrained within certain social systems that conflict with other relations within that system, we have a type of conflict that we could call a systemic conflict. If such a systemic conflict would be unsolvable within the given social system because of the way it is set up, we do have an ingrained dysfunctionality that is defined through the nature of the criticized object itself. We don't run into the problem of having a fragile teleological definition of what we assume to be the proper functioning of a system because the system has these normative definitions ingrained into itself. They are part of the nature of the system. Let me give you an example. It is part of the democratic ideal that its citizens are capable and free to participate to the decision-making of social arrangements. If we want to call our society a functional democracy, these decisions cannot be determined by a certain class that has more power and therefore more privilege over making these decisions. You can find another example of a dysfunctional social system of this kind in my video about schizophrenia. You'll find a link to that video in the description below. But let's now take a look at the critical approach that Jaeggi calls the moral critique. The moral critique denounces that capitalism is an unjust societal system that creates and preserves injustice. It benefits a certain minority of people and takes advantage of a majority of others. A key concept within the moral critique of capitalism is expressed by the term exploitation. This concept describes that capitalism withholds humans from something that they are actually entitled to have. Workers, for example, are exploited because they are unfairly paid, while being the actual producers of certain commodities. Therefore, the relation of what someone deserves for what they get is not just. Jaeggi calls this in her essay the quantitative inadequacy of exchange relations. But there is another side to which exploitation can be criticized. Apart from someone being unfairly compensated for their work, we can also say that the exchange relations within capitalism as a whole are problematic. They are, after all, based on an uneven power dynamic within which people are objectified and in which they don't get the recognition they deserve. This is what Jaeggi calls the qualitative inadequacy of exchange relations. This is the side of the exploitation concept that questions the exchange relation as an exchange relation by itself. Let me give you an example that helps differentiating both dimensions of exploitation. If we say that a certain business is taking advantage of certain people, we can mean that they are paying them a very small amount of the money the business is generating. That is the quantitative inadequacy of the exchange relation. If we, however, denounce the fact that the business is using its power to instrumentalize the people in certain ways, then we are talking about a different way of taking advantage, which refers to the qualitative inadequacy of the exchange relation. What unites both dimensions of exploitation is the shared idea of a certain asymmetry of the conditions within capitalism. Now, there is another definition of the concept of exploitation that comes from none other than social philosopher Karl Marx. Marx's conception sees exploitation as an analytical tool for the way that capitalist economy operates. In short, it describes the way in which capitalists generate surplus value within the circulation of commodities. Within this concept, the worker becomes a commodity that is bought by the owner of the means of production. The worth of the worker as a commodity is determined by how much labor is necessary for the worker's reproduction. The exploitation takes place where the workers generate surplus value for the owner of the means of production that is generated through the labor that the workers make on top of the labor necessary for their own reproduction. Like I said before though, for Marx, this is a strictly descriptive term that describes an economic mechanism within capitalist production. Therefore, we need an underlying normative conception of why that is a problem to transfer it from a tool of economic analysis into a form of critique. The ethical critique of capitalism denounces the mental quality of living within capitalism. Life within capitalism is a bad life. It is meaningless, empty, and alienated. Or the other way around, capitalism prevents humans from living a good life. As for exploitation within the moral approach, a key concept within the ethical approach is that of alienation. There are different definitions of alienation within social philosophy and sociology. Karl Marx, for example, developed the concept of alienation of work, in which he identified 4 ways in which workers are being alienated by the capitalist mode of production. For Marx, alienation is always related to an essential human way of being, which he calls Gattungswesen, that is being disrupted by the different aspects of production within capitalism. Workers are alienated from the products they produce because they don't produce for themselves but for the capitalist. They don't own the products they produce, someone else does. Moreover, they are alienated from the act of production itself. The capitalist mode of production is repetitive, strange, and uninspiring. It is not a valuable thing to do. Thirdly, the worker is also alienated from his Gattungswesen itself. He is alienated from his own needs and can't live his life in a certain mode of expression and harmony with this environment. Lastly, the worker is alienated from other workers. They are foreign to him, and the connection to them is meaningless and empty. While Marx's alienation critique undoubtedly satisfies a certain intuition about how many people feel about living in capitalism, it doesn't come without its problems. Marx's conception derives from an idea of a certain human essence that can't be fulfilled within capitalism. This conception, called essentialism, is problematic because it implies ideas about how humans ought to live by nature. But we know different human cultures have acquired many different ways of living. Another danger with essentialism is that it often goes hand in hand with traditionalism. The natural, better ways of living within these concepts are just drawn from certain traditional ideas how people used to live in the good old days. So, does this make the ethical critique invalid? Well, no. There is a different definition of alienation within modern social philosophy that is not dependent on the idea of a human essence from which we are alienated. Instead of focusing on the question what we are alienated from, it focuses on how we are alienated. As for Marx's alienated worker, for example, we would not call him alienated within this conception because he can't fulfill his true nature, but because he cannot freely appropriate his work without facing certain inner conflicts. So there is a shift of the object of the critical measure from an ideal condition that has to be reached towards understanding the conditions under which humans can freely appropriate something without inner conflicts or constraints. Someone then is alienated if they aren't capable of appropriating themselves or certain meanings. We can still criticize the work condition Marx describes, but we don't need the idea of a human essence as our critical measure to do this. If the worker cannot coherently integrate the meaning of his work or faces unsolvable conflicts within his work life, he is alienated. I put a lot of work in this video, so if you enjoyed it, I would really appreciate if you could like, share, and subscribe. Thank you very much. See you next time.